scream in the darkness of Iwo Jima. The night smelled of blood and sulfur. It clung to the skin, soaked into the pores, settled deep in the lungs like a sickness that would never leave. The air was thick with the acrid bite of burning fuel and a metallic tang of spent ammunition. Somewhere behind a ridge, the sky flickered with distant artillery flashes, brief reminders that even in darkness, death never rested. Richard Collins lay pressed against the cold volcanic sand, his fingers gripping the stock of his rifle so tightly his knuckles ached. He had stopped feeling the pain days ago, maybe weeks. Time had lost its meaning here on this godforsaken rock called Iwo Jima. It was nothing but black sand, jagged stone, and the endless echo of gunfire. He could still hear the voices of his squad in his head, though many of them were gone now. It had started with 23 men. Now there were 8, maybe 7. The numbers shifted with every hour, every skirmish, every burst of machine gun fire that cut through the night like a butcher's blade through raw meat. He didn't like thinking about the names. Names made it too real. Made the dead something more than just shapes in the sand. But he couldn't stop himself. Jenkins, who used to hum old jazz tunes when they marched. Stevenson, who had carried a photo of his baby daughter, folding and unfolding it until the edges were nothing but frayed whispers of paper. Ortega, the big Mexican kid with a laugh that sounded like home. All gone now. Collins swallowed hard, forcing his breath to steady. He had learned long ago that fear was useless out here. Fear got you killed. But the truth was, he was more afraid now than he had ever been before. Not because of the battle, not because of the enemy, but because of the scream. It had come just after midnight. A single, gut-wrenching cry from the darkness beyond their position. A voice he knew, a voice he couldn't ignore. Collins. The name had come out in a raw, strangled gasp, followed by a choking gurgle. He knew that sound. He had heard it too many times before. A man drowning in his own blood. His stomach twisted. He didn't have to see it to know who it was. Matthews. Collins felt his pulse hammer against his ribs as he squeezed his eyes shut. Matthews had been with him since boot camp. They had trained together, fought together, bled together. And now he was out there, alone in the dark, wounded, dying. But Collins also knew what lay beyond their foxhole. No man's land. A stretch of open ground littered with bodies, pockmarked with craters, riddled with enemy positions that had been dug so deep into the island they were nearly invisible. The Japanese didn't fight like any enemy he had ever faced. They didn't retreat. They didn't surrender. They waited, silent, patient, hidden in the blackness, ready to kill anything that moved. Going out there was suicide. He clenched his jaw so hard his teeth ached. Another sound drifted through the night. A weak, broken moan. Matthews was still alive. Collins exhaled, slow and shaky. And then, with a deep breath, he moved. The sand shifted beneath him as he crawled forward, his breath shallow, heart pounding against his ribs like a war drum. He moved with deliberate slowness, pressing himself flat against the ground, his body blending into the uneven terrain, every muscle tense with the expectation of gunfire. The island had a way of swallowing sound, turning every movement into something unnatural, like the earth itself was waiting, listening. The black sand was cold against his cheek, a stark contrast to the sweat trickling down his back beneath the weight of his gear. Somewhere in the distance, machine gun fire rattled, but was farther away, not directed at him. Not yet. He kept his grip tight on his rifle, his fingers stiff and aching from days of relentless fighting. The night smelled of damp earth and something sickly sweet, rot, death, blood soaking into the volcanic soil. He didn't let himself think about the bodies, the men who had fallen and never been recovered, left to become part of the island itself. He just kept moving. His ears strained against the silence, trying to separate real sounds from the tricks his exhausted mind was playing on him. The Japanese were out there, hidden in tunnels and caves, waiting. They had spent months, maybe years, preparing for this battle, carving the island into a fortress, turning the land itself into a weapon. Collins had seen men cut down in an instant, stepping just a foot too far, triggering something unseen. Mines, booby traps, hidden riflemen who didn't need to see their targets. They just needed patience. The wind shifted, carrying with it a new sound, faint but unmistakable. A ragged, wheezing breath. Collins froze, every nerve in his body on edge. He wasn't alone. It wasn't Matthews. He could feel the presence before he saw anything, a shadow against the deeper darkness, movement where there shouldn't have been any. Less than 10 feet away, half hidden in a crater, something shifted. It was small, hunched, barely more than a shape against the black sand, but Collins recognized the outline instantly. A Japanese soldier. The man was wounded, his body twisted in a way that suggested he wasn't going anywhere. One arm cradled against his chest, his uniform dark with something that wasn't just shadow. He was breathing heavily, his face barely visible, but Collins could see the faint glint of his eyes in the starlight. Watching, waiting. Neither of them moved. Collins' mind raced. The enemy was defenseless, probably dying. If he had been able to fight, he would have already. He could have shouted, given away Collins' position, reached for a weapon. But he didn't. He just stared, his breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. Collins tightened his grip on his rifle, the weight of the metal suddenly unbearable. He should kill him. That's what they had been trained to do. No hesitation, no mercy. That was the rule on this island. But something held him still. Maybe it was the way the soldier looked at him, not with hatred, not with fear, but with something else. Something Collins couldn't name. A quiet resignation, a flicker of understanding. They were both just men caught in something larger than themselves. Two ghosts drifting through the same nightmare. Collins exhaled slowly, barely audible, and in that instant, the soldier closed his eyes. Whether it was surrender or simple exhaustion, Collins didn't know. He didn't stay to find out. He shifted his weight, inching forward, his focus narrowing back to the reason he was here. Matthews. Another low moan carried through the night, and Collins forced himself to move faster, ignoring the fire in his muscles, the protest of his own battered body. The ground dipped slightly, and he slid into a shallow crater, the smell of blood thick in the air. He felt rather than saw the body sprawled in the darkness, reaching out, his fingers brushing against soaked fabric, warm and sticky. Matthews, he breathed, barely a whisper. There was no response at first, and for a terrible second, Collins thought he was too late. Then a faint shudder, a twitch of movement beneath his touch. He could barely make out the shape of his friend, but he could feel the rise and fall of his chest, the uneven struggle for breath. "I got you," Collins murmured, barely audible over the distant rumble of explosions. But the words felt hollow, because even as he said them, he knew the hardest part was still ahead. Getting here had been one thing. Getting back, that was something else entirely. Collins barely allowed himself to breathe as he pressed his fingers against Matthew's shoulder, feeling the damp warmth of blood seeping through the torn fabric of his uniform. His friend's breath was shallow, uneven, with a faint wet rattle that sent a cold shiver through Collins' spine. A lung wound. He had seen it before, knew what it meant, knew the odds. But this wasn't the time for doubt, wasn't the time for thinking beyond the next few minutes. Matthew stirred, a weak groan escaping his lips, and Collins immediately pressed a hand over his mouth, his fingers trembling as he whispered, barely more than a breath quiet. It wasn't just the Japanese they had to worry about. Any sound, any movement could bring death down on them like a hammer. He could already imagine the hidden rifles, the waiting eyes, the fingers curled around triggers in the darkness. He didn't know how many were out there, how many were listening, waiting for the smallest mistake. Slowly, Collins adjusted his grip, slipping an arm beneath Matthew's shoulders, feeling the weight of his friend's body sag against him. He wasn't sure how bad the wounds were. He couldn't see much in the darkness, but he could feel the unnatural slackness in Matthew's limbs, the way his head lolled against Collins' chest like it was too heavy to hold up. He had to move fast. The longer they stayed here, the worse it got. He took a slow breath and shifted, trying to pull Matthews with him. But the moment he moved, his friend let out a strangled gasp, his body stiffening in pain. Collins froze, his pulse hammering in his ears, the sound of that small, broken noise echoing in his skull like an explosion. Silence. Nothing. And then, a rustle. Collins' blood turned to ice. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of something shifting in the darkness, deliberate, cautious. Not the wind. Not an animal. He held his breath, his grip tightening around his rifle, his free hand still pressed firmly against Matthew's, as if he could will his friend into silence. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, threatening to choke him. He turned his head slightly, scanning the shadows, his eyes straining in the dim starlight. There, a figure, barely more than a silhouette against the black sand, moving just at the edge of his vision. Slow, controlled, not charging, Not attacking, watching. Colin's heart pounded so hard he thought it might give them away. He knew in that moment that whoever was out there was deciding. A shot would bring others. A struggle would be loud. Maybe the soldier, whoever he was weighing the risks, just as Collins was. Maybe he was just as exhausted, just as aware that death here was as much about patience as it was about bullets. Collins swallowed hard. If he fired now, he might win, but he might also lose. Might draw attention. Might not even kill the man. And Matthews wouldn't survive another firefight. So he did the only thing he could. He didn't move. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them did. Then, just as quietly as he had appeared, the figure melted back into the darkness, gone as if he had never been there. Collins exhaled, slow and careful, every nerve in his body still wound tight enough to snap. He didn't know why the soldier had let them go. Didn't know if it was mercy, strategy, or just some unspoken understanding between two men who had seen enough death for one night. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that he still had a chance. He adjusted his grip on Matthews, bracing himself, and then, with every ounce of strength left in his battered body, he began the slow, agonizing crawl back toward their lines. The sand dragged at his knees, clinging to his uniform, filling the creases of his fingers, slipping beneath his collar and into his boots. It was everywhere, mixing with blood, sweat, and exhaustion, turning his body into something heavier than he thought possible. Every inch forward felt like a mile, every breath a battle against the sharp burn of fatigue. Matthews was dead weight against him, his body limp, save for the occasional weak shudder of pain. Collins moved with agonizing slowness, forcing himself not to rush, not to make a sound. He could hear his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears like a war drum, counting down the seconds to something he couldn't see. His whole body ached with the effort of dragging himself and his friend back toward the safety of their foxhole. Safety. The word felt ridiculous. There was no safety here. Not on this island. A distant explosion rumbled somewhere near the ridge, a dull boom followed by the crackling of fire. For a brief moment, the sky flickered red, casting monstrous shadows across the cratered landscape. Collins ducked his head instinctively, pressing himself deeper into the sand, waiting for the inevitable rain of gunfire. But none came. Silence crept back in, thick and suffocating. He lifted his head, scanning the darkness. The Japanese were still out there. He knew it, felt it in his bones. They were watching, waiting, patient as death itself. Maybe they had seen him. Maybe they hadn't. It didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was that he kept moving. He tightened his grip on Matthews and inched forward, one slow, painful movement at a time. His knees screamed in protest, his muscles trembling with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Then a sound, soft, subtle, a whisper of movement behind him. Colin's breath caught in his throat. He froze. It was close, closer than before. The same soldier? Another one? Had they followed him, waiting for the right moment? His fingers tightened around his rifle, his pulse the wild, frantic beat against his ribs. And then nothing. No gunfire. No attack. Just the silence stretching longer, pressing against his skin like a weight he couldn't shake. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head. The darkness revealed nothing. But he knew. Someone was there, watching, waiting. He felt the weight of it in the air, heavy and unspoken. Presence just out of reach. A ghost in the night. Collins swallowed hard and forced himself forward, dragging Matthews with him, refusing to let the fear take hold. If they were going to kill him, they would have done it already. If they were waiting, it was for a reason. But he didn't have time to wonder why. All he could do was keep moving. The ridge was close now. He could see the faint outline of the American positions, the jagged line of foxholes and debris where his unit had dug in. If he could just get a little farther. A flare shot into the sky, sudden and blinding, turning night into day. Collins didn't think. Didn't breathe. He threw himself into the sand, pulling Matthews with him, his eyes burning from the harsh light. And for the first time, just for a second, he saw them. 3 figures. Close. Too close. Japanese soldiers, crouched low, weapons ready. Watching him. They had been following him, shadowing his movements. And yet, they hadn't fired. They could have killed him at any time. could have cut him down in the darkness. But they hadn't. The flare hissed out, plunging the world back into darkness. Collins didn't wait. He moved. Faster now, reckless, dragging Matthews over the final stretch of sand, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Shouts rang out from the American lines. A rifle cocked. Footsteps pounded toward him. Jesus Christ, we got two. Get them in. Get them in. Hands grabbed at him, pulling Matthews away, dragging them both to safety. Voices shouted. Orders snapped. A medic cursed under his breath. Collins felt himself collapse, his body giving out, his fingers still curled around his rifle, refusing to let go. And just before the darkness took him, he turned his head, back toward no man's land, back toward the place where the shadows still waited. And for the briefest of moments, he thought he saw movement. The figures were gone, vanished into the night, and Collins was left with a question he would never be able to answer. Why had they let him live? Collins woke to the sound of distant artillery, the dull rhythmic pounding that rattled through his skull like a heartbeat. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The world around him was dim, hazy, voices floating in and out like echoes from a dream. The air smelled of sweat, iodine, and blood, too much blood. Then the pain hit, a deep, dragging ache in every muscle, like his body had been wrung dry. His fingers twitched, his nerves screaming in protest, and as his vision sharpened, he realized he was lying on a stretcher, his back against the cold earth, a medic crouched beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. Easy, Marine, the medic muttered without looking up, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. You're banged up, but you'll live. Collins swallowed, his throat raw, his thoughts struggling to piece themselves together. The crawl through the sand. The weight of Matthews dragging against him. The figures in the dark. Matthews. He jerked upright, ignoring the sharp stab of pain in his ribs. Where? The medic shot him a sharp look. Your buddy's alive. Barely. He hesitated, then added in a quieter voice, We don't know if he'll make it through the night. Collins felt something inside him clench. He had dragged Matthews through hell, through the silence and the shadows, through the weight of something he still couldn't name, and it still might not be enough. His gaze flicked across the makeshift aid station, just a stretch of blackened sand where medics worked under the cover of a crumbling ridge. Lanterns cast long, flickering shadows against the torn canvas of medical tents, illuminating rows of wounded men, some barely clinging to life. The war had carved itself into their bodies, their faces. He could see it in the hollow stares, the twitch of hands still gripping at rifles that weren't there anymore. But none of it felt real. What felt real was the memory of that moment in the darkness. The weight of unseen eyes. The figures in the sand. He turned, his mind racing. He needed to see. Needed to know. Ignoring the medic's protests, he pushed himself onto unsteady feet, swaying as a fresh wave of dizziness nearly sent him sprawling. He forced himself to stay upright, gripping a nearby supply crate for balance. His entire body ached, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the ridge, the battlefield beyond, the place where the figures had stood. He staggered past the rows of wounded, past the weary-eyed Marines who barely spared him a glance. Someone called his name, but he didn't stop. He just kept moving, his pulse hammering in his throat. And then he was there, standing at the edge of their position, looking out over the torn, blackened earth where death had claimed so many. The battlefield was empty. No movement. No sign of life. Nothing but the endless sprawl of sand, pockmarked with craters and the twisted remains of shattered bodies. The Japanese were still out there. Collins knew that. They weren't gone. They were never gone. But the ones who had followed him, the ones who had watched him, the ones who had let him live, they had vanished. A cold shiver crept down his spine. He had spent days fighting ghosts, men who melted into the island like they were part of it. But that night had been different. Because they should have killed him. And they didn't. Collins stared out over the wasteland, his breath slow, steady. In the distance, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in deep shades of red and gold, casting long shadows across the sand. The war wasn't over. Not for him. Not for any of them. But he knew, without understanding why, that something had shifted. Maybe it was luck. Maybe it was fate. Or maybe, just maybe, there were things in war that couldn't be explained. Collins turned away from the ridge, the ghost of a question lingering in his mind. And as he walked back toward the wounded, toward the living, he knew he would never forget the way the darkness had watched him that night, and how, for reasons he would never understand, had chosen to let him go.